For a few months now, I've wanted to make a video about one particular European nation, a country that, despite being pretty often mocked for its lack of military clout, or supposed lack of military clout, has a long and distinguished military history with glories that far outweigh the moments of defeat, and in modern times a military that, despite a relatively humble funding position, continues to punch well above its weight in terms of capabilities and efficiency. Unfortunately, today's video isn't about France. Today, we're going to talk about Germany. I'm going to talk about the military of a rich European nation which somehow struggles at times to provide radios, tents, and underwear for its troops, where most of the equipment at any given time is likely to be in repairs or non-functional, and which, when it decided to hand over 50 Cold War-era Flakpanzer Gepards to Ukraine, realised that it really didn't have any ammunition lying around for them. We're going to talk about the Bundeswehr. So what am I going to be covering today? I originally set out when I was planning this video to do a video on German rearmament, and to illustrate all of the different ways Germany could go in rebuilding its military with the funds that have recently been devoted to it. But after looking into the topic a little bit more, I decided that we needed to dedicate a presentation to what was going wrong with the Bundeswehr and what might go wrong in the future. So what we're going to do first is give a little bit of a history of the German military to date, to explain how it got to the position it was in, and talk about the state as we find the Bundeswehr now in 2022. We're going to talk about some good things about the German military-industrial complex and the advantages the Bundeswehr does have going for it, because it's not all doom and gloom. But having talked about the good things, we're going to go straight into the bad. What is going wrong with the Bundeswehr? Where are the systemic failures? And why is one of the best-funded militaries in the world so, on the face of it, dysfunctional? Then we're going to look at the changes, the opportunities. What's going to happen now that Chancellor Scholz announced that there's going to be a massive special fund for rearming the Bundeswehr? And of course, because it's me, I'm going to take a procurement lens on this and explain everything that can go wrong and turn this great idea to revitalise the Bundeswehr into a train wreck. Finally, we're going to talk about how we might want to avoid some of those potential pitfalls to get Germany up to scratch, and link it all back to the ideas of what does Germany do with regards to both Ukraine and the wider idea of European defence, which is certainly back in the highlight reels now. Now, before we get into it, I did just want to level with any Germans that might be listening for a moment. Please don't take this video as a hit piece on Germany or the Bundeswehr specifically. While we're going to be talking a lot about the sort of procurement issues that the Bundeswehr has faced, that's not to say it's the only military out there that's faced these problems. The British have managed to buy rifles with furniture that melts. The Americans have had all sorts of issues with the F-35 program from time to time, and there's been some absolute shockers down under too. Please take this as the video of an Australian commenting on the German military to try and give an outsider's perspective. And I think it's kind of merited because, frankly, the Bundeswehr has a lot of issues, so let's get into it. So to understand how the Bundeswehr became the military it is today, as always, I think it's worthwhile covering a little bit of history. And while I did make the joke at the start, the reality is Germany does have a very long and extremely distinguished military history. The Romans, who were capable of tearing through the ancient Greeks and many of the dominant powers of the day, regarded the Germanic tribesmen as warlike giants, and Germania was the boundary beyond which Rome found it very difficult to penetrate, even as it spread its influence around the Mediterranean. In more modern times, so to speak, Prussian militarism was deeply respected and often decisive, not so much German militarism as the military of the German state of Prussia. So you had Friedrich der Grosse, who managed to achieve tremendous victories, massively outnumbered repeatedly through the power of, shall we say, values that became iconic and associated with the German soldier. Discipline, harsh drill, training, and eventually later on, Germany would cultivate the idea of individual initiative as well. I will say when I'm talking about Prussian militarism here, even though it was generally associated with Germany, it's important not to remember that the other German states also in some cases had quite distinguished military capabilities and history. Bavaria in particular shouldn't be forgotten. But at the same time, we also shouldn't forget that on occasion, the Germans were humiliated by the French, namely Napoleon, and when Napoleon marched into Russia, he took an awful lot of allied German troops with him. But the bit that I think is important to focus on from a historical and a cultural perspective is the understanding that, really, Germany as we know it only exists because of the ability of some of the German states to punch well above their weight, mainly Prussia. If Prussia hadn't been able to defeat the previous hegemon, Austria, it would never have established itself as the dominant German state. And if it hadn't then beaten the French in the Franco-Prussian War in the 19th century extremely quickly and extremely decisively, it's hard to understand how the German state would have formed in the way that it ultimately did, as an empire with the King of Prussia as German emperor. All this was founded on the ability of the German states to punch well above their weight militarily. They developed a force going into the First World War that was capable of tactical and operational innovation far beyond that of some of its opponents. They had an extremely well-honed mobilization system that was capable of putting millions of men into the field rapidly, and an infantry corps that was known for its discipline, artillery that was known for its professionalism, and a leadership style which valued personal initiative. This idea of NCOs showing personal initiative that we prize so much in modern Western militaries owes a lot to the command techniques and leadership styles that develop in the German military. But, of course, this discipline, this tradition, and this skill at the tactical and operational level is completely incapable of overcoming the political and strategic deficit that Germany faces in the early 20th century. Germany starts wars that it cannot win, and it doesn't matter how good its military is if it continues to pick fights with most of the world at the same time. And so Germany ends the two world wars basically broken in two. It enters the Cold War era. And this is a good opportunity to tackle the myth of German pacifism and disarmament head on, because there are those who believe the current weaknesses of the Bundeswehr, at least in the popular thinking, owe a lot to the apparent demilitarization of Germany after World War II, the idea that the Allies took away their military and that explains why Germany is relatively weak in the present day. It's just not true. German disarmament was a reality, but it was a reality for about a decade before both sides, the East and the West, decided they really wanted Germany pulling their weight in the Cold War. Germany was going to be the place where World War III went down. It was going to be the place where the Soviets invaded, or it was going to be the place where the flashpoints lit up and war broke out. So as a result, 1955, the Bundeswehr is founded. Germany, or should I say West Germany at this point, ends up with a military that doesn't look very much like a German military. They make great efforts to make it not look like a German military. It's got American-style uniforms. It's got weapons that are of American style for a long period of time. But at the same time, it's full of sort of Wehrmacht advisors in the early days, particularly early on, and a number of its early leaders did indeed serve in the Wehrmacht. By the middle of the Cold War, this army has grown to the point where it is a serious fighting force. It's about 500,000 strong. It has thousands of tanks and armoured vehicles. It's a quality force that is regarded as one of the absolute linchpins of NATO's ability to fight on the continent. Now, not to be outdone, the Soviets made sure that their Germany founded a military soon after the Bundeswehr was formed, which is how we got the NVA, the Volksarmee, the National People's Army of East Germany. Now, whereas West Germany tried very, very hard to make the Bundeswehr very visually different, culturally different from the Wehrmacht of old, the NVA, and this is admittedly pretty odd for communists, they really lent into the old Wehrmacht Imperial German vibes. They kept the Feldgrau. They kept a uniform that was very, very familiar, at least for dress service. They modernized it a bit. They kept a lot of the old Imperial German marching tunes, updated the lyrics in some cases, but there was a real effort to make this, in some ways, a continuation of the real Germany, in inverted commas, to give it a sense of, I suppose, legitimacy among the German population. And this army, like the Bundeswehr, also grew to very, very large levels. It was about 175,000 strong in peacetime, with the ability to very rapidly mobilize up to a strength of 550,000 in wartime, with relatively good equipment quality and readiness for those units that would be mobilized quickly. It was interesting as a force in the sense that you had a lot of officers who were of working class backgrounds, that had primary or very early secondary schooling as their educational background and were very heavily politicized. But amongst the enlisted personnel, it was a conscript and volunteer-based military, so you had people from all walks of life, and a little bit of a cultural disconnect between the shall we say, more communist-aligned officers and the regular infantry and troops of the army itself. But as a whole, this force was generally a high readiness, relatively well-regarded force. East Germany ran a very high percentage of GDP investment into defence, right up to the closing days of the Cold War, and that really manifested in the size and the quality of the units that the NVA could put together. Now, fortunately for all of us, World War III never happens, the wall comes down, and of course, eventually East Germany and West Germany reunite, which means you have to reintegrate the NVA with the Bundeswehr. This leads to the Armee der Einheit, the Army of Unity. And for a brief moment, as the NVA is absorbed into the Bundeswehr, The German military is immensely powerful. It inherits something like 15,000 vehicles and series platforms from the NVA, while also maintaining its old Cold War strength. A number of professional soldiers from the NVA are absorbed into the Bundeswehr, whereas a small number of officers are kept on short-term contracts, but ultimately mostly let go because a bunch of career communists are not really the people you want leading the show in the new united Germany. But of course, it can't last, at least not from a military strength perspective. The Cold War is over, so budgets need to come down. Plus, in the treaty which allows the reunification of Germany, the final settlement with regards to Germany, there are limits and calls for reductions in the number of personnels and platforms in the resulting Bundeswehr. So the army rapidly begins to shed personnel and platforms. So begins a period of decades in which the Bundeswehr is able to basically live on the leftovers. It inherits huge amounts of material from both the Cold War build-up of the Bundeswehr and also from the NVA. So, for example, the first NATO nation to fly both the MiG-29, so Soviet-built fighter aircraft, at the same time as it's flying a whole bunch of NATO aircraft. Because it's able to live on these leftovers, it really doesn't have to regenerate itself pretty seriously for decades after reunification. Budgets begin to fall, and bureaucracy begins to set in. Come 2011, conscription, which had been the primary source of a lot of the manpower that was going into the Bundeswehr, is suspended. Germany is able to modernize its military in some respects, but for the most part, it just continues a long downward trend in which the military gets smaller and smaller, retires more and more tanks, more and more APCs, retires a lot of its artillery and a lot of its aircraft, even as it modernizes small amounts of what's left. And that downsizing process conceals the deep dysfunction and difficulty that is starting to build up in the German procurement function. They don't have to buy much new stuff, and as a result, their ability and their experience to do large manufacturing runs and to modernize and regenerate large military units starts to fade away, but it's not immediately obvious as they continue to live off this giant pile of guns and things that go boom that's left over from the Cold War. Which leads us to today where, frankly, things aren't great. The Bundeswehr today is many things. It is underarmed, undermanned, but I want to start by making one potentially controversial point which I think is often missed. It isn't necessarily underfunded so much as inefficient. And comparing the German military to the French military kind of brings the point home here. In 2020, German military expenditure was about $6 billion higher than France. This is based on the NATO funding estimates that are disclosed by the Allies that use a constant series of exchange rates and prices to compare like with like across different countries. Despite Germany having a larger military budget than France, the French military has considerably more personnel, considerably more reservists, either more equipment or equivalent numbers of equipment in the key army platform categories, so in terms of self-propelled guns, MLRS systems, attack helicopters, etc. And in some systems, France actually has a very significant lead, like armoured vehicles. France has very, very large numbers of APCs, for example. France also manages to maintain a much larger navy that also includes expeditionary capability. They can take their army and they can go do blitzkrieg operations in Mali, Operation Serval, and a number of other African interventions, and they can do it relatively easily. France has a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, so it has a strike capability that reaches out way overseas, and it's been able to support an operational template overseas that puts the Bundeswehr to shame. Oh, and the French also managed to fit an independent, survivable sea-based nuclear deterrent into their budget. They have 4 nuclear ballistic missile submarines with their own independent nuclear deterrent. That's really expensive, but it's also important and valuable from a political perspective. People can call you a faded empire all they like. At the end of the day, they're going to be slightly more polite with you if your president has the ability to end human civilization as we know it. And the French military budget, despite being smaller than Germany's, manages to somehow pay for all of that. In fact, it's a lot worse than the numbers I just showed you make it seem. Just because Germany has a certain number of platforms and systems, it has so many tanks or so many aircraft, it doesn't mean those things are operational. Now, operational is one of those odd terms. Militaries use it in different ways at different times. Some militaries might say that a piece of equipment, say a tank, is not operational if a headlight is broken, and some might say that it's still operational even if it's missing a track because the crew can kind of get it moving in an emergency. I mean, in Russia, the thing might be operational, even if Private Conscriptovich has stolen all the wiring. It really is in the eye of the beholder and careful definition. But the term is still useful in some senses, and German military readiness, and to be clear here, a lot of militaries struggle with readiness rates. Look at the readiness rates for American aircraft, for example. They have been falling in recent years, and half the fleet might be operational at any given time, depending on what measure you use. But German readiness levels are dire. They were horrible in 2018, and because Germany is a very open nation that believes in accountability, they published figures on this that were available to the Bundestag and thus are available to us. So in 2018, of the 128 Eurofighter Typhoons that Germany had, 39 were operational. 26 of the Panzer Tornadoes out of 93 were operational. 105 Leopard 2s were operational. And you go to 2021, and I looked at the 2021 report, and they look better. I mean, about 70% of combat vehicles are operational, according to that report. But, the devil's in the definition if you dig a little deeper. And a lot of the readiness rates cited in that report, for example, don't measure the number of ready vehicles versus the total inventory. Like, they don't measure against how many of those vehicles you actually have. They use this interesting measure called vehicles that are available. They're verfügbar. And they measure against that. So if 75 tanks are operational, they'll measure that against the number of tanks that are available, which is, I think, 183 to get their readiness rate, even though Germany has almost 300 tanks. So basically what I'm saying is things were bad in 2018, and while they may have improved, there's no evidence that things have been massively overhauled by the time of 2021 rolls around. When people say that Germany should just give Ukraine more tanks, I kind of want to ask the question, does Ukraine only want tanks that work? Because if they do, there's only so much that the Bundeswehr can do. So once you start taking equipment readiness into account, the German military starts looking pretty damn anemic pretty quickly. And this is really brought home by the fact that Germany currently has a stated goal, the Division 2027 goal, which means that Germany should be able to provide to NATO for its ready forces a brigade by 2023 and a division by 2027. Now remember, this is a nation of 80 million people with one of the largest defense budgets on the planet, and the goal is by 2027 be able to field a division, which is somewhere between, say, 10 and 25,000 men, depending on structure, in order to contribute to NATO missions within Europe. Think about that for a moment. You have cases where when Germany wants to send brigades or units on NATO exercises, what those units have to do is borrow equipment from other parts of the Bundeswehr in order to make sure that the units that go actually have everything they need. There was reporting back in 2018 that the Bundeswehr was short on tents. They didn't have enough tents for their people to go on field exercises, and they wouldn't be able to solve that problem for years. There's shortages of things like communication equipment have been reported. We have mocked the Russians so much for not using secure communications and breaking out their cell phones in the invasion of Ukraine. Well, during some NATO exercises, there are claims that Bundeswehr units have occasionally had to do the same thing because of a lack of functional equipment. This all leads to, as you'd imagine, embarrassing absences of equipment when you're on NATO exercises, but also recruitment and retention difficulties. I mean, because frankly, who wants to join a military that takes 3 years to solve a problem that can be dealt with by getting a couple of interns, taking some trucks down to Bunnings, and then putting in some bulk orders on Amazon Prime? Everyone knows the Bundeswehr is in pretty rough shape, which makes it difficult to recruit and maintain people in the military, especially in an economy like Germany, where you've got a lot of competition from the private sector. So basically what I'm saying is, when Ukraine asks Germany for weapons, and Germany says, hey, we don't have many, well, that might be because Germany's still hunting for underwear for the infantry, helmets for the paratroopers, and spare parts for the armoured vehicles. It really is a little bit of a dire strait. Now, that's not to say Germany doesn't have a lot of stuff that it could give to Ukraine or allow to be transferred to Ukraine. We'll talk about that later. I'm just saying, so far as the active duty Bundeswehr's military stocks for the Army and the Air Force, there's not an awful lot there. And I'm going to stop here for a moment and talk about some of the things that Germany has going for it, because I think one of the reasons the state of the Bundeswehr is so remarkable to think about from an international perspective is that Germany's got a lot of things going for it, which means it should be a really effective, feared, capable fighting force. So what does Germany have going for it that should support a military that's far more capable than the Bundeswehr appears to be? And the first thing to say here is that as far as military technology and industry goes, Germany as a country has some absolute world beaters when it comes to defense firms. Rheinmetall is a major prime military contractor that is the world leader in certain categories of equipment. Germany remains home to a technologically sophisticated military industrial base with a very well-educated workforce. In the background there, you can see the KF-41 Panther, main battle tank that Rheinmetall has just revealed. That thing's got a 130mm gun, an auto-loader, an excellent active protection system, comes in underweight, has options for things like drones and loitering munitions. It's a world-beating design. It is comparable, at least on paper from what we've seen so far, to the best of the latest armoured vehicles that we've seen when you talk about tank cannons, for example. If you are a Western country and you operate a main battle tank and it's got a 120mm gun on it, either that is a Rheinmetall 120mm gun, or it is a licensed copy of a Rheinmetall 120mm gun, or it's a derivative of a Rheinmetall 120mm gun, in all odds. Germany is capable of building some real world-beating hardware. It does have some disadvantages. The workforce in the military industry in Germany is not as large as that in, say, France, for example, and it's also highly dependent on its export environment. This is the interesting point. It is so difficult and complicated to sell to the Bundeswehr that most of Germany's military industry only survives because it is able to export abroad. There are far more Leopards in operation with NATO and NATO allied countries than there are in Germany itself, and that goes for an awful lot of what Germany produces in the military field. Germany's military industry is only able to survive, keep on the workforce and the industry that it has, because it is maintaining very expensive low-rate production at home and keeping the lights on with export orders abroad. But when Germany puts its mind to it, it has the industry and the capability to produce genuine world beaters across the board when it comes to military technology. The Bundeswehr has a technological base there if it's willing to access it. The other thing to say is that German troops and German pilots and German sailors are generally really, really good. When a German Panzerbattalion is able to scrounge together enough equipment to get all of its vehicles operational and turn up to a NATO exercise, they tend to perform in sterling fashion. When you had the tanker competitions and the combined arm competitions some years ago, Germany consistently performed very, very well. When German troops have gone overseas, they performed very, very well. The issues here are with retention, they're with staffing, they're with logistics, they're with procurement. They're not with the actual troops and units themselves. The military has some real sharp edges. The issue is that it can't have many active units and many capable units because, as I said, you're scrounging for equipment, you have rifles that don't work, you have equipment with no spare parts, you've got this support chain that has just broken down and decayed over the years, which means that the capabilities of the average German soldier are sort of wasted as they spend a lot of their time waiting for equipment that may never come. But if you were to ask yourself, what is a harder problem to solve? A lack of a strong military culture and capable and trained personnel, or available equipment, you'd have to say it's a lot quicker to replace and upgrade equipment than it is to build a culture, a training environment, and units that are capable of performing their mission in terms of their training and their doctrine. So Germany has a lot of what it needs to be a real military power. It just kind of needs to get the procurement, the organisation, the logistics, the back-end sort of stuff fixed in order to let the units actually, do their job. Now, with all that said, it's time for me to put my defence economic and procurement hat on, nerd out a bit, and try and understand where exactly it's all going wrong for the Bundeswehr, and why, despite spending the money it does, it's in such a dire equipment and procurement predicament. And here it's again worth saying straight off the top, the Bundeswehr actually gets a lot of cash, and it's worth asking the question of where all the money goes. In 2020, the Bundeswehr was the third best funded military in NATO, just behind the UK and the US. Between 2014 and 2021, again using those NATO adjusted figures I talked about earlier, the Germans spent about $400 billion on defence. But what you spend your money on matters. And with Germany, the problem is it ain't new equipment. The NATO figures that are disclosed divide all military expenditure into 4 categories. Equipment, so buying new gear, buying new tanks, new aircraft, upgrading your capabilities. It's the new bling. Personnel is your recruitment, training, your salary costs. What do you pay your people to be there and to be a military. There's bases and construction, and then finally there's the ephemeral other category. In 2021, the US spent about 29% of its military budget on new bling, about the same as France. France spent about 28%. In terms of personnel, everyone spent around the low 40% of their budget going to personnel. Germany spent 42%, France spent 43%. America cheaped out a little bit, paid 37% of its military budget in terms of salaries and personnel costs. In terms of bases, it was all still pretty low, 2-3% each. But the big difference is in the equipment category versus the other category. France, the United States, they spent 28 to 29% of their military budgets on new equipment. In Germany, the number was 19%. Instead, Germany spends a lot of its money, 37% of the defense budget, on other, in inverted commas. Other is kind of like seeing miscellaneous on an accounting statement. It kind of raises an eyebrow and makes you ask questions. Other in the NATO figures includes a lot of things. It's meant to include maintenance and upkeep. It's meant to include operation costs, some R&D, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, when you look at Germany, it's clearly either, if it is being spent on maintenance, it's not being reflected in force readiness ratios, so it's kind of odd to see such a high other category. Also considering the fact that Germany has a smaller number of overseas operational commitments than France and the United States do. Instead, Germany spends significantly more on this category and significantly less on new equipment. And in some ways, this graph is actually a little bit deceptive. See, 2021 estimates, this was actually the best year since 2014 for Germany in terms of directing Bundeswehr funding to actually purchasing new equipment. Back in 2014 and in intervening years, it was actually a lot worse, and that leads to a capitalisation issue. You see, the problem with going cheap on equipment expenditure is if you do it every year, over time you start to end up undercapitalised. So here's a graph showing the total accumulated equipment military expenditure of Germany, France, the UK, and Poland between 2014 and 2021 in US dollars according to those NATO estimates. So between 2014 and 2021, Germany spends around 57 billion US dollars on new equipment using this accounting method. France spends 100 billion. The UK spends 113 billion, and even Poland, humble Poland, with an economy a fraction of the size of Germany's and a defense budget a tiny fraction of Germany's, spends 25 billion. And Poland spends that money in the context of an economy where a lot of what they're buying is going to be cheap and cheerful compared to the sort of things that the German military is going to insist on. Gold-plated solutions, top-of-the-line technology, the latest and greatest customized pieces of kit out there. Poland makes do with stuff that's a little more, shall we say, mainstream, mainline, and as a result, that 25 billion has gone a long way in terms of increasing the capabilities of the Polish military. You have this massive accumulated gap wherein, remember, Germany has spent more money over this period than France has on defense, marginally, but they have. And yet there is this massive deficit, a 43 billion US dollar deficit between what Germany has spent on equipment and what France has spent on equipment. And maybe I should just put that into perspective for a moment, because that's not chump change even when we're talking about military procurement contracts. So what will 43 billion US dollars buy you in the military space? Well, for one thing, it could buy you 2 Ford-class nuclear carriers, which are the latest and greatest in the US military and their associated air groups, which I think is enough to single-handedly cause Tirpitz to rise from the grave, alarms to go off in the British Admiralty, and for Germany to be, I think, legally required to put the Kaiser back on the throne, because at that point, Germany is Europe's preeminent naval power again. You could buy 500 F-35s at a price of, well, more than 500 at a price of 80 mil each, or you could buy enough commercial quad-rotor drones modified to drop grenades, like the kind we've seen in Ukraine, to, I'm pretty sure, single-handedly start like a dystopian robot uprising. It really is a tremendous amount of money if you focus it on a particular project, and it brings home the accumulated equipment investment deficit that the Bundeswehr has faced. Of course, this presumes that if Germany was to allocate $43 billion to buying these things, it would be able to get value for money and delivery on time of this particular hardware. But that's actually the third layer of Germany's problem here. It's not just that it hasn't allocated enough money to equipment purchases, it's that when it does allocate money, it struggles to actually deliver on its procurements and get value for money. so it's time to talk about the German military procurement function. So, with no further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to our good friends, the Bundesamt für Ausrüstung, Informationstechnik und Nutzung der Bundeswehr, which is the federal procurement office that covers single purchasing for the Bundeswehr. It's actually the results of a merger between two previous organizations. The procurement function used to be somewhat split and divided. Trust me, I understand what that's like. I'm an Australian. But what I'm saying is these are the guys who are responsible for doing all the procurement for the Bundeswehr. And I'll say, I really wouldn't want their job, because procurement in the Bundeswehr is best described in terms that, let's say, are not particularly YouTube friendly. And that's because, frankly, when it comes to military procurement, Germany's got a pretty dire record. There's plenty of examples I can go to. When people cover this topic, they tend to focus on the funny ones. I'm going to cover a couple mostly because they illustrate the scale of what we're talking about here. Helmets, air defense, fighters, ships, you name it. At some point in recent history, it's gone wrong for the German military in terms of procurement from our good old friends at the Bundesamt. The helmets purchasing is a classic example that everyone likes to come to. German paratroopers have been waiting for new helmets for about 10 years now. Now, they've picked a helmet. They have decided on a helmet. They wrote a requirement for a new helmet, they picked one, and it's a helmet that's been in use in the United States for many years. Now, the Bundestag's been told by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Armed Forces, Eva Högel, that for 10 years now, there's been a hold-up on buying the damn helmet because the military's still testing the thing. Now, that boggles the absolute mind. As Commissioner says here, the helmet is first tested again quite extensively to see whether it also fits on German heads and really protects as well as we would expect according to German standards. Now, one would think, or hope, that the United States military had done its own testing on a particular helmet, and one would also hope that German heads are roughly the same size and generally behave in the same way as American helmets. We imagine German soldiers also don't like getting shrapnel in their heads, don't like being injured by blunt force trauma, and as a result, a helmet, which is one of the oldest pieces of technology ever invented by humanity, a hard surface which is designed to protect one's head, is kind of going to work the same in the United States as it would in Germany. And yet, 10 years on, no helmet. Because you see, while Russia might do corruption, Germany does bureaucracy. But you know, everyone talks about the helmets. I want to talk about a time the German military really fucked it up. The German military vessel Gurkfock went into port for repairs, and original estimates were that this ship would take 10 million euros to repair. This was many years ago. Now, the estimates while it was in port were steadily revised up. They got revised up from 10 million to 65 million euro once the shipyard had had a good look at it and were like, hey, you know, it's like taking a car into the shop, right? You take it in because you need some, panel beating work done because you tapped another vehicle, and all of a sudden they tell you, mate, you need new brakes, new wheels, new tyres, a new frame, and it'll be 7 times, 8 times more expensive than what you went in for. Kind of what happened with this ship. Anyway, in 2018 there was a review, because, still no ship. They spent 3 months doing a review, and they determined that they should continue working on the ship even though it had been delayed and the costs had blown out, because, believe it, they said they couldn't possibly replace the ship with a new ship. That would be a good idea. This ship was many decades. I think it was half a century old by this point. Well, no, they decide they can't have another ship ready by 2020 until 2025. Repairs can probably be done by 2019, so they go ahead. 2019 rolls around and the ship is not in fact repaired and serviceable. It's instead mostly dismantled. Now at this point, the executives, the board of directors associated with the shipyard, they're kind of fired. They're thrown out because they've done a pretty terrible job. And finally, with new management in place, Germany gets the ship back in service in 2021 for a final price of 135 million euros over the original 10 million euro bill, plus the fact they had to wait a bloody age in order to get this thing back into service. Now, I know you're desperate and waiting to ask, what ship couldn't possibly have been replaced in 2018 until 2025? What ship could possibly cost 135 million euros to repair and was worth this desperate investment at a time when the Bundeswehr lacked radios, tents, underwear, spare parts, combat units? What could possibly have merited accepting these cost blowouts? Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the finest warship in the German Navy. Yeah, no, it's a sailing training ship. This is the Gurkfock. It's a 1958 sailing training ship. This is the thing they couldn't replace in 7 years. This is the thing that they decided it was more worthwhile spending many, many years and 135 million euros patching and getting back into service as opposed to buying something new or, grabbing an oligarch's yacht and turning that into a training vessel for new Bundeswehr sailors. This is German military procurement. And you see, the other tendency that this reveals here, I'm just going to leave the Gorkfock up on screen here for a moment as I talk about this point. There's another pernicious point about going cheap on equipment purchases, on buying new stuff. It's that if you don't replace old stuff, maintaining the old stuff becomes more and more expensive over time. Maintaining a 5-year-old car is one thing. Maintaining a 60-year-old car that has been driven continuously the entire time is much, much more difficult and much, much more expensive. And when you're talking about things like aircraft, which have fatigue in the metal, which have spare parts that go out of production, which have very limited production runs and may no longer have a factory, they may no longer have the people with the original knowledge, in some cases the machine tools have been lost. The cost of keeping an airframe or a tank or an armoured vehicle, but particularly airframes and ships in service beyond their originally intended lifespan, goes up and up and up. And so by making these decisions to keep patching old hardware, keeping it in service instead of buying something new, the Bundeswehr finds itself spending more and more on that other category. More and more cost overruns in refurbs, in maintenance, on just keeping things running, and less money available to buy new stuff and thus cut those maintenance costs. It's a death spiral where if you don't renew your equipment, you end up spending all your money keeping the stuff in service, and as a result, you can't buy any new equipment. That's the death spiral in some ways that the Bundeswehr has found itself in, and it's exemplified by this ship right here. Well, this ship and the fact that they're still going to be flying Panvia Tornadoes in 2030. And of course, it gets worse. You see, it's not just that Germany doesn't spend enough refreshing its equipment, it's that often it's unable to spend the money that is allocated. That is, often the Bundestag votes additional money to the military, but the procurement function, the good old men and women at the Bundesamt, aren't able to spend that fund before the year lapse, and as a result, the money is essentially taken back. Germany operates on short-term financial timelines. And when they do spend the money, the question of how efficient that spending is often questionable. Germany spends an absolute mint on a lot of things it buys relative to the prices paid by some of its other NATO allies. So the result of all of this put together is that Germany ends up with a military which has far fewer operational platforms and far fewer capable units than this raw budget expenditure figure would suggest. It's keeping old systems in service, it's driving up its maintenance costs, and it hasn't demonstrated an ability to really refresh itself the way it really needs to. Which leads to the question, why does Germany struggle to refresh itself so much? Why is procurement such of an issue beyond just a lack of capability and a desperate need for reform at the Bundesamt? And one of the biggest issues here is simply that Germany has very short-term spending horizons. Germany has very short-term budgets. They go for about a year. And the German defense budget is kind of really unpredictable. So often Germany will have projections that the military budget is going to hold steady or go down, but there are annual Bundestag budget resolutions, there are other financial adjustments, which means that at any given time, more money or less money can be taken or added once a year or multiple times per year. So as a result, industry partners who are looking at this really struggle to trust any apparent long-term commitments from the German government. If Germany comes to you and says we want military equipment, you can really only trust them for the content of the upcoming 12 months. Beyond that, it's sort of a bit of a crapshoot. There have been a number of cases where the German budget, as I said, they've projected relatively static budgets. Then everyone's gotten together and said, hey, the Bundeswehr needs more money. They've voted a one-off increase of money to the Bundeswehr, and the procurement function at the Bundesamt just hasn't been capable of closing out contracts and spending the money before the year passes. There's a new budget resolution, there's a new budget, and all that money goes away. Surprise injections of cash don't really do anyone that much good when it comes to military procurement. And that's because military procurement is a very long horizon activity. Because you see, military vehicles and hardware aren't really like ordinary consumer goods. You can't just go down to the shop and buy 100 F-35s off the shelf. Lockheed Martin doesn't just produce a bunch of jets hoping that someone will turn up. Usually companies won't design an entirely new piece of equipment and then do large production runs and wait for the buyers to turn up and take them off the shelf. Defense industry in general bores short timelines. I mean, think about this for a moment. The Joint Strike Fighter project, the thing that gave us the F-35, that started in 1995. The first F-35A flew in 2006, and you didn't see combat-capable units for many, many years after that. Think about shipyards as a long-term investment. The reason for all this is because when you're talking about a new bit of military kit, you're talking about a long tail of investment. You've got to invest in research and development to actually design a piece of kit. Then there's capital investment, because you can't just take over a warehouse and get some guys to bang this out with a hammer and an angle grinder. You need specialist equipment. You need to train your people on it. Often you have very, very tight tolerances, so it's going to take months potentially of refining a production line to get the tolerances that you want. You're not going to produce everything yourself. You're going to get thousands upon thousands of components. If you are Rheinmetall or Lockheed Martin or Leonardo or BAE or any of the major big defense prime contractors, you're going to be ordering thousands upon thousands upon thousands of parts from dozens or hundreds of subcontractors for any given major platform. And it takes time to sort that all out. And if a contract falls over, you've done your money. If you have built a factory which is capable of building F-35 and no one buys F-35, you can't just take it down to the local market and sell it at a discount to, local civil population. If there's no military buyer, you've done your money. Which means before people invest in a system, they kind of want to be sure that government will buy it and follow through. Germany has problems in this respect. An example I can give here, let's look no further than the TLVS program. So the TLVS is, I believe, the taktisches Luftverteidigungssystem, so the tactical air defense system, if I'm translating that correctly. This is the thing that's meant to be, well, it's more mobile than Patriot, it's more capable than Patriot. It's meant to be the air defense and missile defense system solution for Germany. Germany's picked it. This is what they want to build, and they want to put it into service. And as a result, Lockheed Martin have gone into partnership with MEDA Deutschland, so a local company, on a joint venture. And despite the fact that they picked this system, Germany voted for about $2 million for the program in its 2021 budget. They didn't allocate funding to cover a potential contract award or a purchase of the system. They put this tiny token amount of money into the system, which means if you're a manufacturer and you are looking at, well, do I start preparing to produce it? Do I keep my staff on? Do I even bother maintaining the basic infrastructure I might need if we go to an order? And you see 2 million euros gets voted for the program? You might scale back operations. Germany might have picked this. This might have been bid. Germany might pick it. But if Germany doesn't vote the money to sign a contract and cover purchase price, the company's not going to take the risk of standing up a factory, a production complex, getting that supply chain rolling. And as a result, you've seen Lockheed Martin say that they might have to scale back their operations in Germany, which means if Germany ever gets serious about buying TLVS, it's not going to be ready for years because all those people will have to be rehired. The contractor networks will have to be reestablished. It'll take a while to get this thing going. Remember, Germany picked this thing in 2015. We're here in 2021 and the manufacturers are still in a holding pattern. All this means, if Germany's got a reputation, if Deutschland has a reputation for being a bit flaky on the procurement front, not being able to get dollars and euros out the door, then the only way you're going to get manufacturers to agree to work with them is to dial up their prices to 11. You see, if I'm going to have 3 contracts with the Bundesamt to sell equipment to the Bundeswehr, and I think 2 of them are either going to crash through the ground or be delayed so long that I'll lose money on them, what I'm going to do is price all of them so aggressively or write terms into the contract so aggressive so that even if I get a win on one of those contracts, I'm still going to make money. Because ultimately, arms dealers aren't generally in the charity business, and if they were, they weren't going to be giving free weapons to the Bundeswehr. And thus you see the problem. Because Germany has really short-term financing timelines, and because the military industry really, really needs long-term commitments in order to get production going, well, often production just doesn't get going. And so here we are in 2022, and no taktische Luftverteidigungssystem. My Germans judge away at that pronunciation. I'm trying my best. And of course it gets worse, you see, because even when the funds are available, as I said before, the Bundesamt often lacks the capability to actually carry out its job and procure in a timely and efficient fashion. The problem with funds being allocated but not being spent because the Bundesamt can't push the money out the door is obviously a real problem. There are vacancies both in the Bundesamt and in the Bundeswehr which undermine this function. There are just not enough trained and talented personnel in place to, within the framework of the procedures they have to work within, get the job done on time. And what that means is the Bundeswehr and the Bundesamt are very vulnerable to professional services firms, because that's the solution, right? If you don't have enough staff who know how to do the job, how to get the money spent, how to buy the equipment, you bring in the big consulting firms to help you out. The problem is, after any given procurement, well, those guys go home and you're no closer to having the sort of capability you need to run an effective procurement function. It's just another way in which you flush more money through the system in the hope that you eventually get a result. You cover for a lack of capability and staff by bringing in professional services to help out, but that's only ever a temporary and a very expensive solution at that. But let's just say you've done it. You've made it. You've actually signed a contract. You've met all the compliance requirements. It's time to actually buy something. Well, actually, no, it's Germany, so it's time to just start suing each other manically. You see, Germany, in part because of its history, has a very, very big focus on government accountability, of transparency. That means if there's a contract going up in Germany above a certain value, it's going out for competition and it's very openly disclosed. I, a regular Australian member of the public, was able to go on and find out that there is a dishwasher in need of being installed in a building in Gillenkirchen. So I believe that's an AWACS airbase, and apparently they need a new dishwasher. So if you happen to be a company registered in the EU and you want to install a dishwasher for the Bundeswehr, a bid on that is due by July 19th. That's how open and contestable most Bundeswehr contracts are. So good luck buying anything without a mountain of competition and paperwork. And once you do that, look forward to being sued by everyone who lost. And this is both the Bundeswehr being sued and other manufacturers being sued. You see, classic examples. The Bundeswehr recently discovered that a number of G36s, which are the rifles produced by Heckler & Koch, were deficient in, ways that you might want for a military rifle, like the fact that under certain environmental conditions they stopped shooting straight. So the Germans demanded compensation from Heckler & Koch. Heckler & Koch said no, and as a result they went to court and H&K won. Because you see, even though the rifle didn't shoot straight under certain conditions, there was no requirement in the contract for those rifles that the rifle be able to shoot straight under those conditions. They met all the conditions of the procurement and the contract. At the same time, they met all the quality standards that were disclosed in the mountains and mountains of paperwork that went around the original procurement. This is where compliance can bite you. You can have a massive range of specifications, but nowhere in it needs to be able to shoot straight in relation to a military rifle, which strikes me as kind of a deficiency. At the same time, what will also happen is when Germany awards a contract to one manufacturer, often the ones who lose will sue in order to argue that the contract was incorrectly awarded or the process was unfair. These lawsuits can begin even before the bids have been evaluated. They can sue each other in the pre-bid stage in certain circumstances. You thought America was litigious? German defense procurements are incredibly litigious. And again, what happens here is it causes contracts to be strung out, and if contracts are strung out beyond the financing windows that we discussed earlier, well, there's every chance that they're going to be back at square one trying to begin again. So here you have an overstretched procurement function, which lacks the capability to do its job to a sufficient degree, that is focused on compliance rather than a big picture view. They need to tick all the boxes to get things through the door, because what happens is every time something goes wrong, the Germans respond as the Germans will want to do, by adding more rules and regulations. It's never rules and regulations that cause the problem. More rules and more regulations is always the answer, which means an increasingly stretched procurement group becomes so focused on ticking boxes and covering their ass in a professional sense that you lose the focus, or you can in certain circumstances lose the focus on, buying a helmet that works, buying a gun that shoots straight, and getting it bought quickly and under budget. And last but not least, in terms of things that can cause German military procurement to go wrong, and the one that's most likely to get me in trouble out of everything in this presentation, there's the question of politics. Now, I want to be very clear here. I understand that every nation, when it's designing its political system, makes trade-offs in how it's designed. The German system is structured the way it is for a reason. It is designed to avoid concentration of power. It greatly favours coalition governments. It greatly favours accountability both to Parliament and to the people. If you visit the Bundestag, you can see that even the architectural features focus on the idea of accountability. But the nature of German governments that results from this system, which is probably very good for democratic values, doesn't really lend itself to long-term military planning. And in Germany, I think it's fair to say, as an outsider looking in, there's not really a real agreement on what the Bundeswehr is actually for. There seems to be a section of the German population, political sphere, that are uncomfortable with the idea of the Bundeswehr, actually being a military. Germany has an open debate over whether or not it can have armed drones, as if Germany as a country is uncomfortable with the idea that it might purchase a weapon designed to kill somebody at some point. Germany places great emphasis on its independent medical corps. Great discussions on the ability of Germany to support NATO missions and humanitarian interventions abroad. So there's no real political consensus on should the Bundeswehr actually be a war-fighting force. Should it be capable of supporting NATO allies in, if necessary, going toe-to-toe with Russia? Should it be able to support missions abroad with equipment that is suited for, destroying enemy targets, as opposed to just protecting personnel that are carrying out some sort of humanitarian mission? The danger here, I guess, is that because there's no real consensus over what the Bundeswehr is meant to do, you can compare and contrast that with America, where even in a deeply politicized political environment, support for military funding is generally pretty high on both sides of the aisle. In Germany, it's not always the case. And because the Bundeswehr budget is there, there's always the opportunity for different political parties to try and play political games with it because the funding terms are so short. In order to really rebuild the Bundeswehr, in order to have long-term funding horizons, in order to build up the procurement function, in order to build it to fill a specific mission, you kind of need a strong, enduring majority concept of what you're trying to do to make it work. And the German political system doesn't naturally lend itself to those sort of strong, enduring, stable majorities that are capable of delivering those sort of reforms. At least that's an evaluation from an outsider looking in the context of German politics as it's operating today. So all of this, procurement difficulties, litigation, a focus on compliance, short-term budget deadlines, and the political situation that Germany finds itself in, all this causes me to ask the question of whether or not this transformational funding that's about to hit the German military is really enough to overwhelmingly transform it. Is it really certain that the Bundeswehr is going to be more capable, or at least capable enough, at the end of this transformational process? It's time to talk about Scholz and the 100 million euros. Because I'll be honest, this one caught me off guard. If you had told me 5 years ago that it would be a chancellor from the Sozialdemokratische Party who would be the one who would vote 100 million euros of additional funding to the Bundeswehr, man, I would have taken that bet basically at whatever odds you gave me. It was unlikely to happen, but the invasion of Ukraine was transformative on Germany's domestic political front. Scholz came out and announced the Zeitwende, this whole change of approach, this change of era, and with it there was a requirement that the Bundeswehr be brought up to scratch. Germany has started talking about building one of the most capable armies in Europe, and one of the ways to do this was the announcement of a 100 billion euro fund in order to support bringing the Bundeswehr up to speed. The announcement was huge. It was received as Germany rearming, and Germans were left presumably very confused at the fact that the Poles, the French, and the British were cheering at a Germany starting the rearmament process, but it's the 21st century. That said, the announcement was very short on details initially, and it's one of the reasons I waited to do this video for so long. It wasn't certain what this 100 billion would actually be for, and it also wasn't clear whether the 100 billion was going to be in addition to taking the German budget to 2% of GDP on defense, or whether it was going to be additional to that, or it was going to be the means that they got there. Now, looking at this in July 2022, it does seem like the midterm financial plan of the Germans still doesn't take defense spending to 2% of GDP. They're probably going to have to rely on this 100 billion fund in order to get it there, and it's basically going to last out to 2025, or potentially 2.5 years out to the end of this particular government's term. It looks like it's going to primarily be spent on equipment, and the instant question everyone started asking was, what kind of shiny stuff is the military going to buy? We already know, for example, that the Luftwaffe wants F-35s from Lockheed Martin. This will, among other things, give Germany a stealth aircraft capable of delivering American nuclear weapons, which are stored in Germany. But there's a lot of things that can go wrong here. Remember, 100 billion euros is a transformational amount of money. It's all of the money that France spend on new equipment between 2014 and 2021. It's nearly twice what Germany spent over the same period. There's an opportunity here to really refresh the equipment stock. But there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And I'm the first one to say I'm just some Australian on the internet here, so take my opinion with a grain of salt. But from where I sit, there is a real danger that while we might have Finanzminister Lindner standing up and saying he wants to build the best Bundeswehr possible, so one of the best armies in Europe, using this 100 billion euros, there are a lot of dangers in terms of the way this funding is structured. For the first point, it's short-term in nature. 2.5 years in terms of military procurement is not a very long time. It's certainly not a long enough time to give comfort to the manufacturers who you'll need to work with in order to get this equipment built, functional, and operational, unless you're buying off the shelf. It's not committed a lot to specific outcomes or projects, which means that there's plenty of room for the Bundestag to fight over their pet projects. Already there is questions over whether or not this funding should be used to buy weapons in inverted commas or just equipment. If that sounds like an odd splitting of hairs, then I'm sorry you're not German or familiar with German politics. But the key part for me is that there's no guarantee that after the money runs out, you actually do see a sustained investment in rearmament and re-equipment on the German side. And there's questionable political security over those efforts. I'm not sure everyone is committed to maintaining that 2% margin just yet. And if it is committed to, spending that 2% consistently on capital and equipment rather than that infamous other category that has so far eaten up so much of the Bundeswehr's funding. I thought one way to crystallize this might be, just like I did in the corruption video, let's walk through an example of how this could potentially go wrong before we talk about how to avert it. Given this 100 billion euros in roughly 2.5 years, what might go wrong that would cause Germany not to get the impact you'd expect out of this cash? Alright, so the special fund is established. You're at the Bundesamt, you crack open the champagne or the schnapps or whatever, you cheers because it's going to be a busy 2.5 years, and then you have to set about actually making it happen. You've only got the money guaranteed in the special fund for a limited period of time. You got to spend it. You got to spend it now. This may not be how the funding is structured, but it certainly seems to be the intention that it be spent in 2.5 years. Now, the problem is, even though the money's been voted, that doesn't magically mean the Bundesamt is better at its job. It doesn't magically mean that it has more staff. And suddenly, it's got the job of doing more procurement in 2.5 years than it's done in the last 5. In fact, it's doing more procurement in 2.5 years than doing almost twice as much procurement as it's done since 2014. It's a dramatic increase in workload over a short timeline. There's only really one solution if you're the Bundesamt at this point. I mean, it's not like you're going to reform the procurement process or anything. You bring in consultants. You bring in the big professional services firms, or you bring in outside contractors to try and temporarily up your ability to keep up with these procurement contracts. The firms look at you. They see there's 100 billion euros here. So there's a lot of money to be made. Admittedly, there are some short timelines though, and they're not sure it's not all going to be pulled away at the last moment. So let's just say we want to buy a new tank. We want to replace the Leopard with the Panther, with the KF 41 that's just being shown off by Rheinmetall. Rheinmetall's going to up the contract price just to make sure that if this all goes pear-shaped later, they still come out at a profit. So the Bundesamt now does what it does. It lists specifications for the various goods it's going out for. In true German style, these are 1,000 plus pages long, and it will take some period of redesigning and retooling before companies can respond. Remember, one of the features of German procurement in the past has been that German procurement loves gold-plated solutions. They have extremely long and complex specifications a lot of the time, which means you can't usually just buy an off-the-shelf system. You usually need the manufacturer to make dozens or hundreds of modifications to end up with a bespoke gold-plated system that really nails all of those requirements to a T. So the manufacturers they look at your 100 billion and they say, okay, we'll get started. They start redesigning, but that does mean it will be a while before they can start delivering. You say, awesome, you start inking some memoranda of understanding, and you're off to the races. Now it's about a year later. Suffice to say, the high of originally hearing the money has been voted. That's definitely worn off. The sort of haze from the schnapps is gone, and it's now hangover period, as you realise just how difficult this is going to be. You see, because the Bundesamt in this scenario has been pushed so hard, so fast, it's inevitable that mistakes get made. German procurement processes and compliance requirements are very, very high, and of course, because transparency is there, everyone's going to know when a mistake is made. That means it's time to renegotiate with the people who you're purchasing goods from to account for any mistakes you made in the contract. Maybe you missed something obvious. Maybe you realized that your new service rifle doesn't have a requirement that it be able to shoot straight. Or maybe you missed something critical on buying your new Panther tanks. Of course, because you made mistakes, that also means this is the stage where everyone starts suing everyone else. You see, everyone who lost out on these contracts will see that you didn't quite tick every box because you were rushed, you didn't have the resources, you didn't have the capability, and as a result, a lot of these contracts are going to start getting bogged down in lawsuits. You are grinding your way steadily towards the pre-production phase. We might get at the point where Rheinmetall has actually stood up a facility capable of actually manufacturing some of these tanks. The Bundeswehr may actually get these brand new tanks with their integrated loiter munitions, their auto-loaders, and their 130mm guns. But by God, are a bunch of the people in the Bundesamt on suicide watch at this point. So it's now 2.5 years later, and in relatively record time for the German defense sector, Rheinmetall has started rolling out those Panther tanks. They have moved heaven and earth, and the Bundeswehr is starting to get its first deliveries to 1st Panzerdivision. But the problem is there's been a change politically. The 2% GDP expenditure on the military, that's not happening. The Bundeswehr is in fact going back to pre-crisis funding levels. There's also questions out there. Should we really be investing the military budget in weapons, or should we be investing more in defensive equipment and technology? Not tanks and artillery and fighter jets. No, we want to buy more basic equipment. The result is the money is no longer there even for the contracts that you have been associated with, which means the number of vehicles that you're procuring is going to have to shrink. Less money means you can't afford the original number, so you're going to cut the number that you're buying. The problem is that destroys efficiencies pretty quickly. There is definitely economies of scale in any form of manufacturing, and especially in the defense sector. When the F-35 first came out, the thing cost hundreds of millions of US dollars per plane. They're bringing that number down to 80 million through the simple expedient of building a lot of them, at least in terms of military aircraft. As you cut back the number of Panthers that you're procuring, you better really hope that countries across Europe are buying them, otherwise the cost per unit is going to go up. That is, if you want to cut the price of the purchase order by half, you might only get a quarter or a fifth as many tanks as you were originally going to get. All of a sudden, re-equipping all of 1st Panzerdivision seems more like having a few showpieces that you can roll out at parades. Of course, it may be 2.5 years on, but everyone is still suing everyone else. And your other problem is that as the money starts to run out, all those professional services contracts, all those consultants that you brought in to help the Bundesamt, after renewing those very expensive contracts for a number of times, you're going to have to send them home. You don't have the money to pay for them anymore. And what that means is very quickly, you lose all of your surge capacity in the procurement function. You don't have enough people to make it work anymore, which means the Bundesamt can't keep up with the requirements it has to meet, which means everyone starts slowing down, and procurement capacity contracts quickly, and the whole thing starts going into a little bit of a death spiral. So 3 years on, where do we end up? Well, with no sustained increase, not all the new systems that we were going to buy make it into service. We don't end up with a refreshed fleet of F-35s or new attack helicopters or replacement armoured vehicles. We have a couple of them, but mostly we're still operating what we've got. And because we did short production runs with small numbers, they're super cost intensive to maintain. You see, it's hard for Rheinmetall to keep a facility open producing spare parts or doing repairs that is both quick and cheap when they're only supporting, say, 50 or 60 or 70 units in the field. They really need there to be thousands of Panthers, or just like there are 1,000+ Leopards out there, in order to keep the factories operational at an efficient cost and rate. This is one of the reasons why even when the American Army doesn't want more Abrams tanks, Congress might buy them anyway, just to keep the production lines running. As for all those legacy systems you didn't replace, because presumably the Bundeswehr doesn't want to shrink to only be 10,000 strong and just operate the new equipment, you've still got an awful lot of old stuff in service, and some of that stuff by now is very old. And as a result, it's bloody expensive to maintain. I talked before about how as airframes get older, as vehicles get older, the maintenance cost required to keep them running, all else being equal, tends to mount. So if you're still flying the Tornado in 2035, it might actually have been cheaper to be flying the damn F-35, despite the fact the latter is a much more capable aircraft in many ways, because by this point, you're on your who knows what extension of the lifespan of the airframe of this aircraft, and no one makes the bloody spare parts anymore. At the same time, the procurement function of the Bundeswehr, which temporarily surged because they brought on a bunch of consultants. All that capability is lost, and you end up in the same place that you started. My basic point here is that even if you allocate 100 billion euros, if you do it over a short period of time and you make no reforms and you're not careful about it, there's a real danger that at the end of it, you end up with the same old Bundeswehr. Of course, that is a worst-case scenario. There's no reason it has to be like that. There's every possibility that this can turn into a transformational experience for the Bundeswehr. Because I want to stress, despite everything I've seen so far, that I really do believe that German military could be built into a fantastic tool. So here, in a potentially politically insensitive sense, is one Australian on the internet offering his recommendations based on his own experience. I think one thing the Bundeswehr could do is start with a revised force vision, an agreement, an understanding that crosses political lines on what you want the Bundeswehr to be able to do. What capabilities does it need? It seems that Germany agrees that it needs a military. What Germany needs to agree on, in a long-term sense, is by 2035, what does Germany need the Bundeswehr to be able to do? Once that's agreed, once you've got buy-in from a sufficient amount of the political spectrum, the next step is to get some long-term funding agreed, some multi-year funding agreements that let you actually attract industry and convince industry to work with you without the risk that the rug is going to be pulled, and that allows the procurement function to plan ahead. They always have to understaff because they have to plan for the budget that be, and they're always surprised by the increase. This would allow them to plan in advance. I talked before about how the political structures in Germany can make this hard. It doesn't make it impossible. There are, as I understand it, a number of mechanisms in Germany that you can produce multi-year funding instruments. They're used in areas like transport. I'll leave the lawyering to experts on the way the Bundestag and finance in Germany functions. But ideally, what you'd want is a multi-year acquisition and funding plan that lets manufacturers come forward, put their goods forward on the understanding that if they win, the money is there to buy the stuff. And if that's the case, what you'll see is a decrease in the pricing of those contracts and an increased willingness of brands and manufacturers to come forward. I think going alongside this, there needs to be a consolidated strategy, right? So there are multiple ministries in Germany. We've talked about the role of the Bundesamt buying equipment, but there's a lot of different ministries in Germany that all influence defense procurement policy. So for example, defense stresses that when they're buying stuff, they're not factoring in considerations like industry or workforce. That's handled by a different ministry. So there needs to be a centralization that brings all this strategy together the way it is in some other countries. Now, one option here might be to use the Bundessicherheitsrat, the Federal Security Council, sort of a coordinating body between the ministries in order to handle defense policy and procurement strategy. You could equally create a new body. I don't know what the solution might be, but the point is you need to have a concentration, a central point of discussion and decision-making that lets these actions come together. And then, I'm sorry, take it from a country which has done multiple restructures and reforms in its procurement area and probably going to do more. There probably needs to be extensive reforms to the procurement processes. There are some signs already that there are going to be efforts to cut down some of the red tape, but there may need to be, or there may be benefit in pursuing a cultural shift, a legal shift, a personnel and capability upgrade in terms of how the military procurement function operates. Can you reduce the complexity of the requirements? Can you make it harder for people to litigate while maintaining security against things like corruption? Because as I said, the thing here is that whereas some militaries suffer really, really badly from quite obvious theft and graft, with the Bundeswehr, it's more about bureaucracy and overcomplicated procurement processes and the lack of capability to really push through those contracts. So improvements there and upgrades to capability in the back end could be really important. Everyone wants to spend money on tanks, and I'm not sure if anyone on the internet is going to want to hear me say that you need to spend money on bureaucrats who know how to buy tanks. But that's kind of what Germany could benefit from in terms of reforms that will actually allow this transformation to start. And then, once you've got that in place, or you know how you're going to get that in place, you can start a considered forced transformation process where the Bundeswehr takes the immense industrial, intellectual, human capital, and financial potential of the German state and turns it into a military that is befitting of a country with Germany's resources, wealth, and capabilities. And frankly, this is more than just an economic or process issue. It's more than just bad bureaucracy or complex requirements or a difficult legal system. It's a social and political question too. And this is just one Australian on the internet's view, but I really think in order to make this work, Germany needs to decide if it's comfortable with the idea of the Bundeswehr. I've known many Germans. I've talked to them about the Bundeswehr, and one thing I've noticed is that Germans almost feel comfortable laughing at it. They almost feel instinctually more comfortable with the idea that the Bundeswehr is weak and dysfunctional, because Germany as a country struggles with the idea of what it would do if it was actually strong and capable and influential. I think Germany needs to decide if it's comfortable with the idea that military power is a part of its peaceful foreign policy. That in order to have influence, to push humanitarian goals, international trade and development, sometimes having military power makes those tasks easier. Whether it's undertaking disaster relief operations abroad, or whether it's reinforcing national defence and European defence at home. German influence and German diplomacy could be fortified if Germany had, a Bundeswehr that was equal to the resources of the German state, and that it's entirely possible for Germany to build, but that would require a political comfort and a cultural comfort with the idea that Germany would be a military power again. It's like someone needs to explain that you're allowed to have a powerful military without being suddenly required to invade Poland or France again. The two don't necessarily go together. You're allowed to do things with your military other than trying to take over Europe. And that's why I keep coming back to the idea of, can there be a grand bargain over medium-term defence policy? There has been the Zeitwende. The Germans have woken up in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is that enough to build a cultural and political, if not consensus, certainly a majority in favour of a vision of the Bundeswehr as a part of German policy, of defence as an element of what Germany does? Not whether Germany is willing to punch above its weight, not whether Germany is willing to become a major military power, but whether Germany is willing to stand up and punch at its weight class the same way its neighbours, the UK and France do. I mean, I'm not sure if YouTube videos on procurement policy are meant to ask deep philosophical questions, but I'll ask one anyway. Germans, who are you? And who do you want to be? But all of that's in the long run. In the meantime, there's a war going on in Ukraine, and Germany needs to decide where it stands on this issue. So what can Germany do? If the Bundeswehr is low on stocks, and the Bundeswehr is low on stocks, it's hard to see how Germany could keep up with the same sort of arms deliveries that America is putting through, although Germany could still increase it using what they have. What can Germany do instead? Well, in the immediate term, what Germany can do first and foremost is accept and approve any foreign or private supply of arms to Ukraine. If Ukraine wants to buy equipment off Rheinmetall or German manufacturers, it should get the green light. If others who have purchased German weapons in the past want to donate them to Ukraine, give them the green light. Germany has the ability to approve or disapprove those shipments. They should get a blanket green light unless there are compelling reasons not to go ahead. The other thing Germany can do, even though it can't supply weapons, is it can do sort of what it's done so far, but to a greater extent. It can open its pocketbook. It may not have weapons that it can supply to Ukraine, but other people do. So by offering Ukraine financing, a number of billion euros per month, to go out and purchase equipment, Germany could do much more for Ukrainian security. In fact, I would probably argue that a share of that 100 billion should have just been allocated to Ukraine instead, because German security situation is ultimately going to be supported by the very actions that Ukraine is taking right now. The other thing I'll say, because it cannot be minimized, is that Germany's willingness to accept the hydrocarbon transition, the potential cut-off of oil and gas shipments from Russia, the reduction in dependence on Russian hydrocarbons. This is important. This is something that will cost Germany. It won't destroy Germany, but it will cost Germany. And Germany's willingness to hold the line and continue supporting Kyiv diplomatically and economically, even as Russia turns the economic screws on German industry, that's going to be important going forward. Okay, so where does that leave us? Ultimately, what I've argued today is that the German military has suffered very badly in peacetime since unification. It's run down its stocks of capital, it's underinvested in new equipment. The procurement capability is inefficient, it's hampered by political decisions and short-term funding horizons, which make it really difficult for Germany to turn around serious modernization programs, even if industry is capable of delivering those solutions, which it usually is. There is a genuine danger that even though this 100 billion euros has been put into a special fund, that funding surge doesn't meet the needs of the German military because of all the barriers that are in place to prevent that financing delivering real procurement outcomes. There is an option for Germany to build a really world-leading force for the funds that's allocated, not much more. But serious political and organisational reform is required in the procurement function, the political sphere, to make sure there's long-term funding, etc., to make sure all this comes together to turn the Bundeswehr from something that people laugh at to something that people can be genuinely proud of and which boosts German prestige and influence on the world stage. There is a wider political and social question here, and there are questions around Germany's role in terms of European defence, but this video is long enough as it is, and I'll come back to those another time. It's important to stress that given Germany's population, its resources, its wealth, its industry, its capabilities, its knowledge, its wherewithal, its traditions, Germany should be a significant military power, but it's got a way to go to get there. Alright, channel update to close out, and I will keep it short because I know this has been a bloody long one on procurement policy of all things. The first thing is thank you very much for the patience of all those who've been waiting for this particular video. I know you've been waiting for a while. I just wanted to see how German politics shook out a little bit before I did the video. And once I went down the rabbit hole of what's wrong with the Bundeswehr, well, I couldn't quite stop myself. I did, of course, decide to keep this one semi-reasonable in terms of length, to split the idea of what could the German military look like, what shinies could it buy, and what is the real potential of European defence? Like, what could you do if you went nuts and integrated European defence industry and policy to make something that was competitive with the United States? I'm leaving that for a different video. I will also say cheers to my patrons. I'm putting out a video, a long video on German defence procurement policy, history, failings, and bureaucracy, and then advocating for hiring more capable bureaucrats and streamlining purchasing regulations is not really top grade YouTube fare normally. It's having a strong patron and viewer base that gives me the courage to do that, along with, of course, my sponsors. I'll also say that I'm trying to keep up at the moment with the one video per week on this channel production speed, and also trying to do the occasional Terra Invicta video. I will say the reason things like the Discord server and whatnot are waiting is because I'm putting all the effort I have into making sure I can keep up this production schedule on topics that I really care about and would like to cover. I'm considering whether or not I want to let that slip a little bit in order to invest a little more in getting sort of the back-end organization done. But for the moment, I'm focusing on just getting the videos out at the same pace and making sure the quality is there. Speaking of quality, the old microphone is still in service, but what we've overhauled this week is the recording software and processing dramatically. I hope it has made a difference. Please let me know if the sound quality has improved, declined, etc. I'm not an expert, but I'm trying to improve it every episode, and I'm hoping we've gotten a little bit closer to the ideal. So that is all. If you've made it to the end, congratulations. Thank you very much. I appreciate it immensely, and I'll see you all next week.